Hello and welcome back to our Cael language series. Today we're going to start a new series looking at the speaking sections on the Cael test. We're going to look at an overview of the speaking task today to understand exactly what types of speaking tasks will be asked to complete. And we'll also discuss how these tasks are scored and what the evaluators are looking for when you give your answers. So to get us started, we have to really understand the difference between the language that we use day to day and the language that we're expected to use in an academic setting, like on the Cael test. Let's have a quick look then at how we would communicate in the day-to-day world. If you can imagine sitting around the lunch table with some friends or spending a day with your friends and family out in the community, the type of language that you'd probably be using to communicate with would be very informal, quite casual, and even a little bit simple. We often will speak in slang terms. Sometimes we will use idioms and colloquialisms. Oftentimes the ideas too that we communicate are a little bit on the general side. It's really unusual to suggest an idea and then back that idea up with, say, 2 or 3 specific examples when we're meeting among friends. The opinions that we might share as well tend to be just delivered as face value without being backed up with evidence. The vocabulary that we use, I think, and if we're speaking in a casual setting, would also be a little bit on the simple side, and we're not too concerned about the level or even the variety of words we use. We sometimes will repeat the same phrases and not pay it any mind at all. You might notice too that among a group of friends, you'd even have a couple of conversations going where the topics of conversations ramble off in different directions and might eventually circle back to the first topic that you started speaking about. I don't think we're even concerned at all with our grammar as we're speaking among friends and family members. We might speak in short, choppy, simple sentences or even sentence fragments. So all of that is perfectly fine and acceptable in the day-to-day world. But as soon as we start to prepare for an academic test like the Cael, we have to completely change our approach to the way that we use language. On the Cael test, we will be expected to use formal language. So all of the ideas that we present should be supported with very specific details and examples. Any opinions or statements that you make need to be backed up as well and supported. Hopefully, our vocabulary on this test is going to be high level and sophisticated. We're looking for a good variety of words as well, words that are quite precise. We would never want to use vague words like thing or stuff or very simple terms like that on a Cael or any academic test for that matter. Everything we talk about needs to be on topic and address the question that we're referring to. We want to be concise. So we want to get from the beginning of our response all the way to the end without stopping, but we want to make sure that we do so by offering novel ideas. We don't just want to talk in circles and repeat ourselves until we get to the end of our responses on this test. Hopefully, as we're speaking, we're really conscious too of speaking in complete sentences and also demonstrating complexity. So we're not just speaking in short, simple sentences. We're combining those shorter ideas together as we speak using different conjunctions. So hopefully we've got some nice complex and compound sentence structure as well. Now, moving forward with that idea of what academic language is all about, you can see here how the entire Cael test fits together. There are 5 parts altogether. There are also 5 speaking questions that you'll be asked to complete. The first 3 questions fall in part 1 of the Cael test. You can see here they're all in red, so we can identify them quite easy. In part 1, we're only speaking. We call this independent speaking because, again, that's the only skill that we're completing. By the time we get on to parts 2 and 3, you'll notice that we're combining the speaking. We're integrating the speaking with a different skill set. So in part 2, first we will read a passage and then we will speak about what we've learned. And in part 3, first we will listen to an academic lecture and we'll speak about what we've learned there. So there are a couple of different things to note, I guess, about these different tasks. So we'll start with the independent speaking tasks. These 3 questions fall in part 1. Again, we call them independent because we are only speaking. There is no reading, there's no listening, there's no writing. We're just speaking. The first two questions in this section of the test will be about you. So you're going to use information from your own life experience in order to answer these questions. The third question here is going to be on a visual. So this will be some sort of a chart or a graph that the computer will show you, and you're going to talk about it and make some conclusions as well. We'll look at a couple examples of past test questions from part 1, just to give everyone a sense of what is expected on this test. So your question is always going to be here in the top right-hand corner of the screen. So this question says, what do you want to study at university and why? The second question, we call it type B, is here as well. It says, in your opinion, what are some of the strengths of high school education in your home country? So again, both of these questions, the first and second, type A and type B, will be about you. Here's your third question from part 1. This is an example of a visual, so a type of chart or graph, as you can see. So the information will be in front of you, and you'll always be asked to describe and explain what you're looking at first, and then draw some conclusions about that information. So this entire part of the test, part 1, really only takes about 10 minutes to complete, because you're simply answering those 3 questions in a row. Once you've completed part 1, you're well on your way now into the integrated speaking tasks. And again, we call them integrated because you're combining the skills together. Remember, in part 2, first you're going to read, and then you'll speak about what you've learned. In part 3, you'll listen, and then speak about what you've learned. In both parts, you are expected to use the source material. You're no longer taking details from your own personal life to answer here. You're not doing that at all. In the integrated sections, your answer comes strictly from that source material, so from the reading and the listening. And as a matter of fact, that's partly where your score will come from, based on how well you're able to do that. So again, let's look at a couple examples of past test questions, just to get us thinking about what's involved here. So your question's in the same location on the screen. It says, why do engineering disasters happen, and what are the causes of errors? So on this part of the test, I guess the test takers would have read all about engineering. They would have answered questions all about that. Then they would have answered this question. So you're already quite familiar with the content. But on this part of the test, if you would like to click on that reading passage tab at the top, it is going to pull up the entire reading passage again. So you can skim read it through. You can have it facing you as you're speaking in case you want to pull information out and use it to record your answer. All right, the listening is structured in the same way. So here's our question this time. This is from a past test. This one says, what are economic models and how do they help us understand the economy? So assuming this topic was about economics, so a different topic compared to the reading one. Likewise, on the test, you already would have listened to this lecture and answered questions. So the lecture is very fresh in your mind, and then you would speak to it. Again, if you want to jog your memory, so you've got some ideas facing you as you're talking, the computer will offer you a summarized outline of the important points from that lecture. All you need to do is click on the lecture notes tab right here at the top of the screen again. So this can be facing you as you're speaking, as you're recording the answer. Now, you may have noticed on every single screen, right above where the question is, in that top right corner, we've got a preparation time, and we also have a speaking time. It's really important to use the preparation time efficiently so that we're most prepared to actually record the answer. So let's talk briefly about some of the things we should be doing using that time. So when you start your question, that preparation time clock is going to start counting backwards. And as soon as it reaches 0, you're automatically going to start recording your answer. So this preparation time will include the length of time it takes for you to read the question, and then you're starting to think about your answer. So the test administrators will give you paper and pen, and I would recommend that you take some really short but quick notes. So jot down your main ideas that you want to talk about, and then start writing down some specific examples and details as well. If there are any particular academic vocabulary words that you'd really like to use in your answer, I would write those down as well. Okay, start thinking about how you'll organize your response. So maybe number them on the page so you know which ones you'll talk about first, second, and third, for example. and think about your opening. How are you going to introduce this topic? So when the clock reaches 0, it's time to record. So you'll notice here that the timer is actually a blue bar. It's going to take whatever length of time you've got to speak. That's how long it takes for that blue bar to reach the end. All right, when that blue bar reaches the end, time is up, and the computer will simply stop recording, finished or not. So we really do need to keep an eye on the timer. When it gets to about here, I would say, you'd want to offer a concluding statement so that you're finished speaking right about now, and the computer would stop. Now, if you get cut off in the middle of your concluding statement, I wouldn't worry too much about that as long as you have offered a very full and very well-supported answer. The raters are going to be flexible with that to a point. You know, nobody's looking for perfection, but you don't want to get cut off in the middle of something really important. That would hurt your score. Likewise, you don't want to make your answer too short. So if you're looking at this blue timer right now, imagine if you stop speaking right at this moment, you still have more than half the response left to go. So if your answer is simply too short, you likely haven't given enough detail either to really earn a strong score for that answer. So again, it's a bit of multitasking, I guess. You're looking at the notes that you made during the prep time, and you're speaking into your microphone, but you're also keeping an eye on this timer so that you can make sure that you're wrapping up your response within the correct amount of time. And the last thing I'll point out here is you probably noticed that gray bar is bouncing gently up and down over top of that icon of the microphone. This is what you want to see on the test. This tells you that the microphone is working, that you're speaking at a comfortable volume, and the mic is registering your voice. So that's there to reassure you. If that gray bar is not moving, there's a problem with the equipment. So you would want to get that fixed immediately. But this is what you should see as you're recording your answers. All right, one more thing to mention about your prep time and your recording time. So looking first at those 3 independent speaking questions from part 1, you will have a slightly different amount of time to prepare and to speak, depending on the question. So always look at your question screen in the top corner where you see that amount of time recorded. You have to know before you begin how much time you have to prepare and how much time you have to record. You will have anywhere from 30 seconds to 60 seconds to prepare in part 1, depending on your question. And the length of recording varies as well. It actually starts at 1 minute. The second question, you'll speak for 90 seconds. And then that third question, you will speak for 2 minutes. So in part 1, the recording time will progress a little bit each time, gets a little bit longer. You're always scored on your content, of course. Your details need to be accurate and well organized. Your language is always assessed as well. Remember, we want nice academic language. How well you reference the details in that chart as well is going to be part of your score for that last question there in part 1. The integrated speaking, because it's a slightly more complicated skill set, you're now speaking about what you've learned either in the reading or the listening. You do have more time to prepare. So you've got about a minute here to prepare. The speaking time, though, will also be longer. So you'll be expected to speak for roughly 2 minutes on the question that you're given on the test. It's almost like giving a small presentation to discuss what it was you learned in that particular source material. So you're scored the same way. You're still scored on your content details, your language use, but again, how effectively you take ideas from the source material and explain them in your own words is also going to inform a large part of your score. So bear that in mind. It takes practice to do these things effectively, which is why we're tuning in together here today again to study. So a brief word about the scoring before we talk about what the raters are looking for in your answers. You'll see here on the chart before you that the Cael test is scored in what we call bands. So the lowest score, I guess, anybody might earn on a Cael would be band 10. So looking at this chart, that indicates somebody is a low beginner. So they're just starting out their language studies. When you work your way up to the top there at band 90, that's the highest score anybody could achieve. And if you're earning an 80 or a 90 band score, that shows very expert proficiency in the English language. So the score that you need is going to depend entirely on the reason why you are taking the Cael. So some people take it to enter studies at university or college here in Canada. Others take it to apply for work as well. So please check with whichever school or whichever employer you're looking to apply to with the Cael score. They will determine exactly which score they need for you to achieve before they will accept you. All right, and that number might vary. So one school might expect, say, a band 70, while a different college might ask for a band 80. And likewise, one employer might say band 70 is sufficient. Others might say, well, band 60 is okay. So it's really a case-by-case situation. So you'll want to do your own research to make sure that you're very well prepared for your own personal goal. One more word about the scoring I'll mention is you'll notice that there are no half bands in Cael. Everything is rounded to the nearest increment of 10. So as we're talking about speaking here today, remember there are 5 speaking questions that you're going to answer. So every single question is going to be scored, but then those 5 scores that you now have for speaking, once you finish, those 5 scores will be averaged together. And that's going to give the overall speaking score. So if somehow after the average of those scores is tabulated, and let's say they arrive at a 7.5, well, following the rules of math, of course, a 7.5 would round up to an 80. So that person then would luckily end up with a band 80 overall. If, on the other hand, you averaged out at about a 7.4, well, then that would round down. So that person would then therefore end up with a band 70 overall. All right. So again, we just follow the basic rounding rules in mathematics to arrive at that even number. No half scores in Cael. But I'd like to finish off today just by talking a few minutes about what the raters are looking for as we give our answers on the test. So they actually consult this exact checklist. And I'm going to encourage you to use this checklist as you study over the next several weeks or months, depending on your schedule. So there are 4 categories up for consideration. We'll start with the delivery skills here. So the raters are basically going to assess your speech delivery, your presentation, your public speaking skills. So think about all the things that you would need to do with your voice in order for somebody to understand what you're saying. So I think the most obvious ones would be pronunciation. That's key. If we're not stressing the words in the right places, we can't understand what you're saying. So pronunciation is the most obvious one, I would say, and volume as well. We have to speak loudly enough so people can hear us. And also the speed. We don't want to speak too quickly, but we also don't want to speak too slowly. So we want to really adopt a nice, natural, fluent rhythm as we are speaking. Okay, now the more challenging aspects of speaking, I would say, to really master would be to speak from the beginning to the end of the response with minimal pausing and also minimal interjecting. So I think you'll notice if you ever get stuck for an idea or for a word, oftentimes we might stop and say, And when we make those sounds once in a while, it's really not a problem. I think it's actually quite natural. I'm sure I've interjected a few times as I've been speaking with you today. You turn on the news and you listen to a news reporter, you might hear them interject once in a while. It's natural to a point, but only if we do it once in a while. We don't want to do it too often. Imagine if you're pausing or interjecting in the middle of every sentence. You're really going to frustrate your listener, and it's going to take a long time to get from the beginning to the end of your answer. So when you're practicing at home, try your very best to speak with confidence and not stop as much as possible. Get right to the end of that answer. And it does take practice. Let's move on and talk about the accuracy of language. The vocabulary is key. Basically, we want to have a nice, complex vocabulary. It should be sophisticated and interesting, yes, but it also should demonstrate a variety. So we don't want to just repeat the same conjunction or transition or start all of our sentences with the same word or phrase. Even if it's a high-level one, we still want to show a good variety so that the listener does not get bored with the repetition. All right, so really change it up to the best of your ability. The words that we choose also need to be suitable and precise. We spoke about that a little bit earlier, I think. But again, we need to make sure that the words are accurately being used. They're there for a reason, and they make sense in the answer, pretty much. When you're speaking, please do speak in complete sentences. And again, aim for a variety there as well. So complex sentence structure is a great idea, but again, change up the structure. Don't always start with the same conjunction. Try your very best to demonstrate a good variety in your structural choices as well. Using transitions, by the way, to introduce your main ideas and connect the specific details. That's really going to help your listener follow what you have to say and will really help maximize your score here under the language use. Let's talk about your content next. So clearly, all the details that you choose to include in every single answer have to be on topic. So generally, in the first sentence or two of your answer, you'll be answering the question itself. You'll be giving the focus or the topic sentence, if you will, of the entire speech. And then everything else you speak about is going to present a main idea or reason that supports the topic. And then for each main idea, you'll also want to have examples and specific details. Now, when you're speaking about yourself in those first two questions in part one, those details come from your own life experience. So that's great. Remember, when you're speaking about the chart or about the reading and listening sources, that's where your details and examples will come from as well. So please do bear that in mind. The tone that you create here also should be academic through speech. So your tone is created, I think, by the words or vocabulary that you select. So remember, as this is an academic test, there's no need to use slang or idioms. All right, as soon as we start using language like that, it takes away from the academic nature. So avoid that if you can. Also, avoid very generic words like thing and stuff and things like that as well. That would not demonstrate academics. So we want to just avoid anything that's going to take away from the high level quality of this answer. Hopefully your ideas are easy to follow. I mean, there's generally a first, second, third, and there should be a good reason why you've organized your answer that way. It should flow quite well. And the listener should be able to get from the beginning to the end of your answer with you, follow along and understand everything that you have to say. Now, hopefully you've got time to include a quick summary statement or a closing remark. Usually the very last sentence that we make can summarize the main idea that you've been talking about. And sometimes it might even take a little look ahead to the next step or a future idea. That's another way possibly to end it. And last but not least, when we look at the task fulfillment, the raters are assessing for two things really. So the first one is about the time. So if you've been asked to speak for 2 minutes, did you speak for 2 minutes, right? Is your answer way too short or is it much too long? Hopefully it's as close to whatever the time is at the end for them to give you full credit for that. And more important, or as important, I guess, would be how fully you've answered the question. So when you looked at those sample questions that we looked at today, and in the next several weeks to come as we practice more speaking, I'm hoping that you'll notice a lot of the questions on the Cael test have two parts to them. There's often a how and a what, for example, or a why and a how, or something to that effect. So it's really important to give enough details to answer all parts of the question that you're being asked. So that's partly what the raters are also going to look at here. Now, last but not least, this little quadrant here right at the end is just for that visual, for that chart question. So remember, your score when you talk about that graph is going to be based on how accurately you're interpreting the information that you see there, as well as how well you're explaining the trends. So you're identifying which elements of the information is increasing or decreasing or fluctuating or remaining constant or whatever it happens to be. And last but not least, you are also giving accurate conclusions about what you're learning about. You're offering your own insight to interpret the information. So again, I'm hoping a really, really great way to study your speaking and to improve it would be to practice your questions out loud at home. Set up a timer once you get comfortable with that so that you're practicing speaking for, say, the 2 minutes, so you know what that feels like. But as important, I'd really encourage you to tape record your own answers, say even into your cell phones. So after you finish speaking, you can play back the recording of your own voice in the privacy of your own home where nobody can hear you. And hopefully you can even type out your own transcript. So literally write down word for word what you said. Even if you've made some mistakes, write out word for word what it is you said. So with your transcript facing you, you can look at this exact checklist. And you should be able to identify what you're doing very well and which areas you need a little bit more work on. So this is going to help guide your study patterns at home. So you'll use your time efficiently. There's no sense studying something that you already do very well. You want to use your study time to improve the weak areas. And that's different for everybody, right? Everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses. So please determine which ones are yours, and then you'll be in a position to do something about it and hopefully improve your skills before you take the test. Okay, we're going to stop there for today. I think that's more than enough information to get us thinking about what's expected on the Cael test. In the next episode, join me next week, please, and we're going to start looking at particular practice speaking questions. And we're going to generate some ideas together and practice answering them using all of the skills that we've learned about today. I will see you then.